but before we go there, actually, I'm curious about the right to left thinking concept, and because it's quite different than the way we've often done things. We do often start more at the left, I suppose. So if you could tell me a little bit about that.
Well, we're the product of our environment, and all of us have been taught to read from left to right, to think from left to right, because we start out with goals and objectives, and then we think about, well, now what do we have to do to accomplish those goals and objectives? And outcomes are sort of a secondary, a byproduct. They may happen or they may not. And left to right thinking is also historically how accreditation programs and agencies have worked. Because what they've looked at is they haven't looked at the outcomes, they've looked at the process, where you start with your goals and then they look at the processes. And if those processes are in place, then the assumption is, two assumptions. Number one is you're a good agency. And number two is that you're going to have outcomes. Well, I think the evidence is pretty clear that process does not lead to outcomes unless you start with what are the desired outcomes and what processes need to be in place in order for those outcomes to occur. Now, in that regard, what's happening in many places that have really gone into the supports paradigm and the quality of life paradigm is that they develop their individual plan around the domains. And so that you have an indication as to what are the wishes and goals of the person in reference to those 8 domains. Some may not be appropriate, but many times and most times they are. And then you build your support strategies, as this example that I gave earlier of the gentleman. You build your support strategies around those domains. And then when you measure your outcomes, as you will be doing in your pilot project, then you are really shuffling the deck in your favor. You see, I think what's happened from my perspective historically is that if you look only at process, then outcomes are almost by happenstance, by accident. And if you don't focus on your outcomes first, then all that you do in terms of process may have no relationship whatsoever to outcomes. And I think that's exactly what's happening in terms of the consumer empowerment movement. I think parents, I think funders, policymakers are increasingly asking, what are the outcomes do we get from the services and supports that we provide? We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar business. And unless we as a multi-billion-dollar business can demonstrate that what we do has some significant impact on people's lives, i.e. personal outcomes, then I think the support for programs will decrease, not increase. I've talked to many legislatures and ministers and deputy ministers and et cetera, who say, why should we give more money to agencies to do the same thing they've done in the past if the result's the same? And so it really, I think, is a reality that service providers and policymakers, that agencies such as yours really are increasingly facing, is the reality that we are in an outcome-oriented world. We're not in a process-oriented world. Now, then how does right to left thinking relate to that? I want to go back to your question. Right to left thinking relates to that because you begin with the end in mind. I think as we become better managers of resources, we will do more targeting of supports, and we call those individualized supports.
And that's something that British Columbia is really excited about, and it is a direction that we've been moving in. So I'm wondering if you could tell me a little, because you've worked with many jurisdictions, and I'm wondering if you can tell me about what that change looks like with jurisdictions or agencies that have moved in that direction. What's different about how they're doing things now?
Yeah. Let me give you an example of a program that I think has probably taken the supports paradigm and the quality of life concept to its logical conclusion. Because you're moving in that direction, and this is sort of the image of what that logical conclusion is. It's a program that's in the Netherlands. It's called Ardan. The history of Ardan is a fascinating history in and of itself. They started out as a large institution. Conditions were so bad there that the staff literally went on strike, and the director of Ardan, who is now deceased, a fellow by the name of Peter, he was actually arrested because he's a staff member who was arrested because he was ordered to go back to work. He said, I will not go back to work. Well, to make a long story short, over the years they have simply divested themselves, and they are now a completely community-based program. They're also very technologically based, as they have a real-time data system. What they do is every client is assessed on a called the SIST, the Support Intensity Scale. So they know immediately at the input phase what the support needs of people are. Their process is they build their ISP around the 8 core domains, and then their outcomes are they have developed an outcome scale very similar to the Personal Outcome Index from Edmonton. It's called the Personal Outcome Scale, and everyone is evaluated every 1.5 to 2 years on that scale. So what they have done essentially is they've aligned their system. And a system, has an input, a throughput, and an output. And the alignment is the input is the needs of the individual, the throughput is addressing those needs within the framework of quality of life, and then the output, or the outcome, is the assessment of personal outcomes on the personal outcome scale. The net result of that is they have seen unbelievable growth and development